nevertheless, it is the figure 6. Parallel lines which seem from the distance appear to be equally distant from each other. And when we look at that figure 6, the people who have been designing in plan and section already can imagine that this purely line drawing of geometry, if thought of in space, actually presents the screens. 3 screens or 3 membranes through which we look at the object. And each of them, in a way, are different, although we know they are equal. Here is one example where Erwin Panofsky describes the perspective, linear perspective, that later on came with Renaissance, and then the angular perspective. And in the angular perspective, we can see that the diminishing of the lines is definitely not in mathematical concordance with the distances. Whereas in the line perspective, the geometry builds it so that the same ratio that we can see in the membrane actually corresponds to the distances of the spaces from the viewer. I'm talking about it so long because the next thing I think is extremely interesting for some of the ancient projections and medieval images. Of course, we know how to construct the perspective space, but here Panofsky is showing one example what happens if we imagine that this cone of vision really is a part of a sphere of vision. And the surface, the projection surface itself, is not a straight line. And the image there in the middle is then the result of that type of imagination. I have made it a little bit more clear because it doesn't self-explain it. But up there we have a plan of a box, and down here we have a section of the box. And on the upper part of the lower surface of the box, there are straight lines. And these straight lines in linear perspective would actually come together in one focal point, the one point central perspective. But if we imagine that the surface of the projection is circular, it really does not add up, and we achieve something that is called the fish perspective or the fishtail perspective. The lines do meet, but they meet on the axis of symmetry or at the axis of the focal point. What happens here is that what I propose is that our mind tries to adjust it to the one focal perspective or 3 focal perspective as the natural vision of ours tries to build up the space, so that there is a diminishing focal point, and depending how wide we look, then there might be several focal points. And what happens here is that, to my mind, this type of perspective really pushes our mind so that it tries to straighten up the surface, the curved surface that has been used. Let us, here it is also described, the same type of logic of angular perspective is described by Euclides. So these are the 2 different types of looking at perspective since antiquity. And of course, the perspective as a structure, imaginary structure, goes very deep into the history, at least 300 years before Christ. This is the 1428 drawing, which one can find in internet, and compared to Santo Spirito that Brunelleschi was designing, and this is one of the first well-known images of central perspective on the right-hand side. And we clearly see that there is a similarity of the two-dimensional surface, description of the space on two-dimensional surface, and then the photograph that in a way has been made by a lens of a photo camera, diminishing the spatial bipolar vision of natural perspective into a central perspective of clear optics of lens. And we can also see that it is not entirely central perspective. It has moved away from the central axis, but nevertheless there is no other focal point for the lines to meet in that particular drawing. Brunelleschi's story with perspective and complex geometry he was using at the cupola, of course, is a very interesting one. I'm leaving it aside. This is the octagon of the baptisterium, built in the 11th century. And of course, the beauty of the baptisterium is that it is a very clear geometrical form. It allows itself to be imagined and seen as a pure geometry. And here it is from the other side. So the cathedral is right behind, or the baptisterium is right in front of the Duomo, and there is the campanile, which is standing separately, and baptisterium and cathedral form one axis of composition. So standing on the doorway, as Vasari tells us Brunelleschi was doing, he could see the frontal main gate of baptisterium and see that geometry of the octagon so well. So we might look at already well-known picture from the first lectures, when the light comes and reflects from the surface, it organizes the space into the horizon point of view of the viewer, and then we can see two diminishing cones, or two pyramids of vision. One side from the light that comes to us as parallel rays, and then from the vision, due to the optics of our seeing, we can see it as a cone of vision. So two cones of geometry really come together, which is important, which I hope to demonstrate very soon. So octagon of the baptisterium was well organized and well seen. So it could be described from the viewpoint of the plan and elevation in great detail. So this was probably, and of course these are both images that come from the reconstruction, because the painting itself has not survived, and then the photograph, which in a way is already a reduction of the reality, because it is this one focus, not bipolar but monopolar vision through a lens of a photo camera. So Brunelleschi in a way came back to the question of membrane. And if we imagine an object behind that membrane, and we imagine the geometry of the vision, this is, the red is the projection, if we think of perspective as a pure line geometry that Euclides was describing in his optics. So what Brunelleschi did was standing at the doorway of Duomo and looking at the octagon of the baptisterium, and made a painting. He made the painting where he was, and he made the painting according to Vasari, using the plan and the elevation of the baptisterium to test whether out of these two elements he can reconstruct or represent the image of the baptisterium. And this he did with a peculiar device. So it is well described, therefore we know about it. So, as you probably who have studied the perspective know, the distance from the two-dimensional surface we look at the image is actually the one that will define the two focal points where the rest of the image will diminish. So there is a regulated distance from the two-dimensional surface. And when you put your head closer, it is distorted. And when you are outside, it is also distorted. So there is a fixed point. And usually it depends on the size of the paper you are, or the size of the screen you are using. And very often this 60 centimeters is roughly the 30 centimeters of a circle where you should experience the perspective image to get the best imagination. To do that, Brunelleschi made in the focal point of the drawing, which is not right there. It is too low, but the focal point, of course, it depends where the horizon was. So he made a small opening so he could see through the painting. Has anybody heard of this story before? Okay, then it might be interesting. So he made the painting according to the plan and elevation, then made the opening into it, looked through that opening, and had in a fixed distance a mirror. So he could see his painting through the painting, and then he could lift the mirror and see and check if the reality was close to what he was doing. The only thing he couldn't do was the sky. Therefore, it is described that instead of sky, he was using a thin film of silver or some kind of reflective surface. So actually, the movement of the sky he could also capture in his image. But what is happening in this type of structure, of course, it is mathematically, it is the similar triangles which appear with the reality and with that type of drawing. But what conceptually happens is that you know that you are looking to yourself, that hidden there behind the reflection is your own eye looking to yourself. So there is this kind of double cone or double pyramid of vision with a potential or imaginary self on the other side as the focal point. So the focal point becomes actually an invisible eye. And that has been then clearly described by Piero della Francesca in his famous Ideal City painting that comes roughly later than Brunelleschi's description of Santo Spirito. That is the real proof that he was doing this perspective drawing. According to Vasari, he was also doing two paintings. He did one from the doorway of Duomo, so it is this one diminishing point perspective of the baptisterium. But he did another from the of the Palazzo Vecchio, and who has been in Firenze. Palazzo Vecchio, of course, isn't that easy from the viewpoint of geometry. So I would say rather surely he did use several focal points there. Otherwise, it would not have worked. But this Piero della Francesca's image of the ideal city is very captivating. It has this kind of mystery around it, and much of that mystery is also created by the one focal point perspective. All the parallel lines to the picture plane do not have diminishing capacities. So it is the orthogonal lines that have been diminished. And here the same happens, which I think happens with the angular perspective of ancient Greece. And just as a comment in between, I think the Greeks didn't really need perspective diminishing or perspective adjustment, because most of their art really was on the ceramics. So the ceramics already had curved surfaces. So in a way, the drawing was always three-dimensional on these curved surfaces in ancient Greece. And of course, we knew from Parthenon, we know clearly that the optical illusion of of the perspective has been used in Parthenon. The diminishing point of the vertical lines is roughly 5 kilometers above in the sky. So it was impossible to measure it. It was created as an adjustment, and all the vertical and horizontal lines in Parthenon coming to us from 400 before Christ roughly is adjusted. All the horizontal lines are surfaces of a curve, also with a radius the same way, 5 kilometers under the surface. So it had to be adjusted another way. It had to be adjusted from purely imaginary point of view. And in history books, very often it is described that this optical illusion in the ancient temple buildings was used to make the lines straight. That is not right. If you go and enjoy the Parthenon yourself, you can clearly see that it, on the contrary, it emphasizes, it enhances the perspective, makes it more strong, makes the building much bigger and more prominent than it really is. And that has been used as a high-class quality of design in Parthenon, surely. So that was the remark. Now, if we come back to Piero della Francesca, we can see that these parallel lines create a kind of alienation for people who are used to photographic perspective, or the legitimate perspective, as it was also called, the perspectiva artificialis. And I think that produces the same effect. Actually, we want to, our mind wants to pull this curved surface into the correct perspective, if we might say so. So here I did the diminishing or the 3-point perspective out of Piero della Francesca's drawing. Awful violence, of course, to the painting, but this is what I think happens when our mind really works with these alienated perspectives. It brings the central part in front of the viewer, makes it slightly come off from the surface of the image. This is what I believe. But with Piero della Francesca's image, it's slightly more complicated. Here we see the diminishing point in the opening of the door, which probably is the case that Piero della Francesca knew about the experiment Brunelleschi was doing. And he used the same type of doorway. It's a beautiful symmetrical building, but the doorway is unsymmetrical. So this imaginary counter eye is actually looking at us. And this is what Hubert Damisch was writing. Yes, I always remember the incredible gesture that Martino Oberto then allowed himself. Armed with a scalpel, he unhesitatingly removed the tiny bit of painting, revealing in precisely the spot I indicated to him a small conical hole, doubtless marking the point of insertion of a needle or a nail, to which the painter had attached strings in order to trace the network of receding orthogonals. To anyone made uncomfortable by such a violation of the painting's visual integrity, I'll answer as follows. And then he goes on saying that this particular point really makes the perspective a living being, that there is this counter eye. And in his book about perspective, he makes a whole story out of it. But this hole, or the pinpoint, or the hinge of the drawing, for him is really very important. Makes the whole understanding of perspective work in different levels, from purely illusional point to the existing materiality of the panel itself. So Hubert Damisch writing about the perspective drawing there, and we clearly can see this focal point being being placed there.